A while back, this Twitter post got a lot of attention. Now, I know I'm not the first person to discuss this post in a video, but I just want to use it as a jumping off point. The general idea, and you should pause and read the whole thing, but the general idea is the poster is upset that Wizards of the Coast has been catering to Commander players at the expense of its tournament scene for the past half-decade. In doing so, he compares Commander players to pigs eating slop, which, unsurprisingly, drew a lot of attention away from his main point. A lot of people took offense to that comparison, but as the post currently has 4.7 thousand likes, clearly a lot of other people identified with it. Now, I don't want to rehash or relitigate the main discussion points around this. The question I want to answer in this video is not whether the farm animal analogy is correct or appropriate, but why. Why are people resonating with such a negative portrayal of Commander? And why specifically do competitive players tend to dislike Commander so overwhelmingly? People often point to newer trends like Universes Beyond, the accelerating conveyor belt of new product, and the changes to popular tournament formats in recent years, but these are secondary effects of Commander's popularity, not core to the identity of the format itself, and not the reason why people avoid engaging with Commander in the first place. Another reason people cite for players disliking Commander is table politics, and while I do think this accounts for some of the reason, the presence of multiple opponents does, after all, change Magic's gameplay pretty significantly, it's, again, not the core of the issue. Absurd outcomes in CEDH games do pop up on social media from time to time, such as this guy who publicly apologized for lying to his opponents about whether or not he was going to try to win the game, I guess. A perhaps more typical example, though, is this one from content creator and former Magic pro Sam Black, where his opponent used Emrakul the Promised End on him to steal his turn, but was forced to give him an out to win because otherwise Sam could just concede during the Emrakul turn. But these situations are mostly a function of CEDH, or competitive EDH, which has only existed since 2015 or 2016. As a former competitive player who has also played Commander since 2008, I've been hearing people's aversion, sometimes disdain for it, for nearly as long as I've known the rules, and I'll admit to having some of those same feelings. One tournament grinder I knew told me he played Phage the Untouchable in EDH, and when I asked him how that was supposed to work, since as commanders are cast from the command zone, Phages lose the game ability it would always trigger, he replied, "Oh yeah, my best goldfish is turn 2. I go, turn 1, land Soul Ring, turn 2, land Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, cast Phage, then I lose the game and don't have to play anymore." Another friend, when I asked him why he didn't play EDH, expressed the same sentiment by saying, "I am a high school student with a very high IQ, I am not playing that format," which I'll admit is the kind of person who should be kept away from the Commander pods. Maybe a more succinct expression of skepticism was when a friend asked me, "So, I don't get Commander, you're supposed to not try to win, or what?" In asking that question, what he's saying is sort of a slant on the simplest answer for all of this, that Commander is a casual format. The common wisdom is tournament players want to win, so of course they wouldn't care for it. This may have made sense in the late 2000s. There were no real tournaments, no stakes, and barely any organization, so Commander was casual by default. The word didn't have a positive definition. It described something existing in opposition to competitive Magic. We didn't know what it was, but we did know what it was not. And at the time, that was fine. But curiously, in this modern era of Magic Con, CEDH play, and content creation, the idea that Commander is a casual format has persisted. It's become almost a thought-terminating cliché, something you say because it's easy rather than because it's accurate. The truth is that Commander's subsumption of Magic's collective consciousness betrays it as far more than just casual. As anyone who followed the bannings in 2024 and their aftermath knows, Commander is, if not truly competitive, certainly quite serious. There are a lot of factors that go into how casual and how competitive a game ends up being, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole there. But I think it's fair to say that by far the most important is the game's rule system. Famously, Super Smash Bros. Melee was intended by its developers to be a casual party game, but a strong competitive scene formed as players discovered advanced techniques that gave it a lot of depth and a high skill ceiling. I think an especially instructive example for our purposes is the difference between the card games Bridge and Pitch, also known as Setback. Superficially, they seem pretty similar. Both are trick-taking games, both have a bidding phase, and both are usually played with 2 teams of 2 players. But it turns out that because Bridge involves using the whole deck and has a lot more complexity in its bidding and scoring, it is a vastly more competitive game, with a World Bridge Federation and an American Contract Bridge League and ranks like Grand Life Master. Shit, dude, I want to be a Grand Life Master. pitch is a game you play over drinks or with your family, and there is some decision-making, but who wins and who loses comes down more to luck of the draw rather than skill. And luck versus skill is another one of those topics that you could make a whole video on and barely scratch the surface of. My main point here is it's peculiar that for a casual Magic format, Commander is perhaps an even more difficult game than Magic's premier competitive formats, with the only check on how much your decisions affect your chances of winning being that it's a 4-person free-for-all. Sam Black talks about Commander actually being a more difficult game than 1v1 Magic in his thread on light versus heavy gamers here. So why do people call Commander casual if that's not a natural outcome of its actual mechanics? I think the best place to start looking for an answer is in Commander's philosophy document. Though no longer officially part of the format since the transfer of Commander from the Rules Committee to Wizards of the Coast in 2024, it's been on this website in some form since at least late 2010. The late Sheldon Menery, Level 5 judge and former Commander Rules Committee member largely responsible for popularizing the format, has stated that the founders have always had this vision for it. I want to look at some of the specific wording this document uses for 2 reasons. One is that it's been historically important in shaping players' attitudes, and 2 is that Wizards of the Coast uses a lot of similar wording in its announcements to this day. This isn't ancient history. The second sentence is the one that really starts laying out this idea that Commander is something different. Where other formats are managed to create an environment where continuous improvement and zero-sum gameplay are desirable and incentivized, Commander offers an environment where those goals are not the only things to aspire to. And I have a lot of small quibbles with the wording. There's some passive voice, it's a bit verbose, but I really want to look at these terms zero-sum gameplay and continuous improvement. The former is a slight variant on a real term, zero-sum game. And while they sound interchangeable, a zero-sum game typically describes the outcome of the game, not the gameplay or the process. 1v1 Magic is a zero-sum game, but technically so is Commander. Winning the game means the other players have lost. What I imagine they're going for is if I play a Trained Armadon in 1v1, I'm planning on getting in there turn 4. Whereas if I play a Trained Armadon in a 4-person free-for-all, because there are several people who could attack me or who I could make an enemy out of, he's probably just chilling. Or she. Wait, how do you tell what gender an Armadon is? Oh, okay, yeah. So that interpretation makes sense, something akin to parallel versus orthogonal gameplay. But because it isn't a common term, it's not clear that's really what they mean. You could easily read the word zero-sum as being about the fun that results from the gameplay. And then the message becomes that it's not possible for both players in a 1v1 game to be having a good time at any given moment. And even in a tournament, I don't think that's true. Experiences don't solely consist of winning or losing. As for continuous improvement, are other formats really managed that way? Surely if this were the case, they'd have banned Vivi Ornitier. Ornitier? What the fuck? Is it French? L'Ornitier? Okay, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce this. They'd have banned Vivi a little sooner, for one thing. There's not much room for continuous improvement in a format with 1.5 decks. I think a more accurate characterization is that officially sanctioned formats are managed to help Wizards sell packs. Way back in the 90s, when Wizards split Magic into Type 1 and Type 2, they did it in large part because they wanted people to actually buy the Ice Age and Homelands expansions rather than sit back on the fantastically broken Power 9. You can see the same incentives with the Modern Horizons sets, which effectively turned Modern into a rotating format, unlocking another dimension along which Wizards could monetize the game. In one recent ban announcement, they basically acknowledged this. Sure, an effect of these decisions is usually to maintain a healthy competitive environment, but I would argue, too, that even without Wizards' intervention, people would still be competing and therefore trying to improve. The struggle for mastery is a human one, a part of ourselves rather than an external influence that can be imposed upon us. Calling standard and modern competitive formats is just a shortcut for where to look for tournaments, and a commitment to some amount of balance at the highest level. Well, usually. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great that Commander wants to give people a different experience, but it shouldn't have to improperly characterize other formats to do so. And finally, there's this circular statement. The rules and ban list express the gameplay philosophy which informs the RC's decisions, which are to modify the rules and ban list, right? I guess overall, I don't think that this paragraph does a great job introducing how Commander is going to differentiate itself. It sounds like the philosophy hasn't moved past the idea of casual Magic being the negative space around competitive Magic. So let's move on to the 3 principles that, up until a year and a half ago, defined Commander, and maybe we'll get a clearer answer. For right now, I want to focus on the first 2 because I think they're more important for understanding the casual-competitive divide. Very quickly, I do like stability as a principle. In this post-COVID, post-fire design world of endless reprints and eternal formats that effectively rotate, it's nice that Commander is at least capable of standing in meaningful contrast to that. I play with a group that has barely changed their decks since 2018, and I like that that's possible. So, when I called Commander a casual format earlier, I did that knowing that social has replaced casual in more official parlance. Sheldon Menery has written a pretty comprehensive article that explains why this is, and I agree with his statement here that casual is a vague term with a definition that varies a lot depending on who you ask. And Gavin Verhey, who writes many of Wizards Update articles on Commander, uses social all the time to describe it. To be honest, though, this kind of bothers me because it implies that other formats are not social. Personally, I've met the majority of my adult friends, directly or indirectly, through competitive Magic. Competitive Magic isn't just the tournament play itself. It involves planning trips, coordinating practice and deck construction, going out to eat during events, and, believe it or not, doing things that aren't Magic, like going to the zoo after getting X3'd in the Team Grand Prix. Not that I would know. And I'm not the only person who's thought of this. Gavin Valentine says basically the exact same thing in this Distraction Makers video. There's also this tweet I saw recently, which reads, "I think it's really ironic how much more 60-card Magic helps you develop social skills than Commander, the social format." Now this one is a bit hyperbolic. Sometimes you get people who try to angle shoot or who get salty, and I do think competitive players can be sort of overly hierarchical. But I do think that at its best, tournament Magic can encourage stuff like teamwork and sportsmanship the same way that real sports can. Like this reply says, there is a camaraderie to competitive Magic. People talk to each other not just because it's human nature, but because they want to get better. That's why the best, or most well-connected, players have testing teams for the Pro Tour. The competitive Magic community does have issues, but being social isn't one of them. And this kind of sentiment feeds into negative preconceptions people have about Magic in general. I've had a lot of fun playing casual Commander, but ironically, without the organized play system of the mid-2000s, I don't think I would have gone on to meet the people with whom I currently play casual Commander. It's also weird hearing Wizards, some of whose employees work there in part because of their history doing community organizing for the game before Commander was popular, parrot this idea that Commander is so much more social. So now let's move on to creativity. Much like calling Commander social, calling it creative implies that competitive formats are less creative, and that belies a misunderstanding of what creativity is. Most simply, creativity is the act of coming up with new ideas that have meaning. In more traditional creative disciplines like visual art, people use techniques like perspective, color theory, the rule of thirds, and so on. I'm not a visual artist, so I apologize if there are better terms to use than those. But they act as a shared structure for the artist's aesthetic or emotional vision to build on top of. In tournament Magic, meaning is more simply winning. I think a lot of people have the misconception that because you can always copy a deck off the internet and win with that, competitive Magic isn't creative. But I would argue that, 1, creativity still exists in piloting the deck. The definition perfectly fits having to come up with the best play in a new situation. And 2, having this shared goal with your competitors makes the variety you do encounter more meaningful and thus more creative. For example, the Rakdos deck that Seth Manfield from Channel Fireball took down Pro Tour Murders at Karlov Manor with only really added this vampire combo to the same basic strategy of the Rakdos deck that was already popular in Pioneer. But that small change clearly made a huge difference. Not only did Manfield win, Vampires put up the best win rate of the tournament. Pre-Modern is maybe an even better example, as it only allows cards from 1995 to 2003. Nothing rotates in or out unless the ban list changes. Still, you see innovation all the time. Maybe the most notable example in recent years is this Stiflenaught list designed by David Raska that Brian Selden used to win LobsterCon, the largest pre-modern tournament of the year. You may have to squint to see the changes, mostly Flash of Insight and Parallax Tide, but those 2 cards help a lot in shoring up the deck's control matchup. The former by giving card advantage that includes essentially an instant speed Demonic Tutor, and the latter by attacking the control deck's mana in a way that was particularly nasty to interact with. And due in part to this innovation, Parallax Tide was banned earlier this year. Around the same time, Stiflenaught players began to develop totally new strategies for playing certain matchups. For example, against Replenish, they realized that sometimes you can actually just counter the opponent's win conditions, which are only Opalescence, which turns all your enchantments into creatures, and Replenish, which gets the Opalescences back from the graveyard. With this plan, they would skip the titular Phyrexian Dreadnought combo entirely, winning by decking the opponent with some help from the seldom-used second mode of Vision Charm. So despite being a closed format, Pre-Modern still gives rise to creativity because 1, the card pool facilitates relatively diverse and balanced gameplay, and 2, the shared goal of winning acts as an incentive to come up with new and meaningful ideas. Commander, on the other hand, attempts to sort of decenter winning. The philosophy document says, Magic is a competition in the same sense that all games are competitions, but whenever the act of competing comes into conflict with a social atmosphere, Commander prioritizes and protects the social atmosphere. Details on how that scenario might manifest itself are, of course, frustratingly absent. But it's not that Commander is devoid of creativity. Rather, Commander's creativity appears to lie in the personal boundaries players create for themselves. So, for example, 100 decks under $100, how I destroyed my friends with a deck I built from a landfill, only playing cards from my friend's collection that he was willing to fart on. You've probably seen these YouTube titles before. Well, I made those ones up, but you know what I'm talking about. Budget deck building is especially popular in part because the restrictions are more concrete. Anyone can go on Scryfall and confirm, if not that the deck destroyed the poster's friends, that it really could have come from a landfill. Less YouTube-ready constraints like I want to build a Merfolk deck, or how can I beat my friends with Verdant Succession, are also perfectly acceptable sources of creative inspiration. It can be fun to see what your friends come up with even from simple ideas like that. One of my friends runs Niv Mizzet Reborn with Gigantha as a companion, and the first game I let him untap with Gigantha in play, and then untap it again and again, I was like, oh, I've never seen that before, that's cool. And I imagine that's probably how Team Channel Fireball's opponents felt when they saw Sorin Imperious Bloodlord and Vein Ripper being used together. There is a similarity there. But while the Pro Tour created an environment in which Team Channel Fireball's new tech was meaningful, you can't really say the same thing for Kevin. Sorry, Kevin. The idea may have been new to me, or even something he came up with on his own, but in the context of the greater Commander community, it's not. There are over 100 other deck lists on EDHREC doing the same thing, and there's no real incentive to be the first. People are always impressed by my Iname Death Aspect deck that uses Songs of the Damned and Mass Reanimation to destroy the opponent's creatures and make them discard their hands, but really I just cribbed it from a guy on a forum 15 years ago. Is that creative? Maybe if I don't tell anyone. Human beings are social creatures, and therefore meaning and novelty have a social dimension. Without a shared goal, what does it mean for a deck to be good? What's the point of the innumerable threads asking for underrated cards that are deserving of more play? What's the point of any of this? We know what cards are strong in the conventional sense because of CEDH, but when winning is not a particular goal, we're left to either guess at what the poster's personalized idea of good is, or project our own onto them. And that leaves these discussions feeling hollow, indicative of a creativity that is empty on a larger scale. But what does the philosophy document have to say about this point? The first examples it highlights are decks rooted in lore, showcasing art, and telling stories. But not only are these genres of deck vanishingly rare, they aren't meaningful. Shuffling up a pile of cards with art you like, by which they secretly just mean expensive foils, but let's pretend otherwise for the sake of argument, has no relation to the actual gameplay. People love to name-drop the Ladies Looking Left deck as emblematic of the unique creative possibilities Commander offers, but beyond its existence as a meme, it is essentially a half-assed Angel deck. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't constitute creative expression any more than equipping your favorite Fortnite skin does. Content creator and former Commander Rules Committee member Olivia Gobert-Hicks used similar language in this card market video.
My time on the RC and the CAG was that, you're trying to tell a story is the way they always framed it.
But stories, as my high school English teacher once told me, are built on conflict. Commander is very explicitly aimed at smoothing over the edges of conflict. Sheldon Menery liked to call it the Beer and Peanuts League, and Verhey, in the same card market video, calls it the format where you can just chat with your friends while you're playing. A game with a strong storytelling element is Dungeons & Dragons, and it achieves this by being cooperative, where the conflict is in the challenges the players face together. Commander is not set up like that. The powers that be appear to have confused Commander with an actual storytelling medium, and beyond that, by elevating players' individual standards for creation over the collectives, they've confused, I think, personalization with creativity. But to truly understand how Commander attempts to fulfill every player's individual expectations, and to truly understand Commander, we need to talk about one more thing: Rule 0. This is Commander's official unwritten rule, which is basically that players should have a pre-game conversation to make sure their expectations and decks are evenly matched. And on the surface, this sounds reasonable. But the first thing I want to point out is that Rule 0 is unique. No other game has this. Certainly not to the extent that it's officially recognized. Well, with one exception, pre-play talk is a pillar of BDS. Sorry, folks, I guess the feed glitched out. Where was I? Right. No other game has this. That's not necessarily a bad thing. After all, Magic the Gathering is the only game with cephalids. Wait, they're octopuses now? Excuse me? No, I'm just saying that if Woke can come for the cephalids, who can... It's an important... No, I'm not deleting it. Okay, so to explain why Rule 0 is unique, first of all, games are most broadly a structured form of play. Usually that structure comes in the form of rules, and those rules create agreement between players so that play can happen without devolving into a big argument. One game that messes with the idea of agreement being fundamental to games is the card game Mao. It plays kind of like Crazy Eights, where players go in turns trying to get rid of all their cards and drawing from the deck if they can't make a play. But the twist is that new players aren't allowed to be taught the rules. They have to figure them out through trial and error, with the dealer issuing penalty cards for infractions. Generally, players aren't even allowed to speak at all, except when the rules dictate they must. And if this sounds annoying, that's because it is. It's meant to mirror the arbitrary laws of its namesake regime, Mao Zedong's Communist China. But we'll come back to communist regimes later. For now, the point is that Mao is built around this gimmick. It is the exception that proves the rule that games need this kind of agreement to be games. And ultimately, Mao is kind of a meme. Once everyone is in on the joke, it's really not that deep. It's never going to be more popular than Crazy Eights or Uno. Commander, meanwhile, brandishes its lack of structure with no sense of irony. An old version of the philosophy document used to say at the very end in bold text, "The format can be broken. We believe games are more fun if you don't." Aside from sounding unnecessarily ominous, this is an admission that the rules as written don't generate the agreement needed to play it. That it is the concept of a game, the same way Donald Trump at the last presidential debate said he had concepts of a plan for healthcare. It's an absurd thing to say because plan and no plan are discrete categories. Either you have one or you don't. The same applies to games, especially ones as popular as Commander. If your friends are helping you playtest an early version of a board game you're designing, they'll probably forgive you if the rules are a bit unclear. But this is Magic's most widely played format. Externalizing the need to agree on the rules subverts players' expectations of what games are in a way that's misleading and leads to unnecessary social conflict. The natural result of all this is that players will fill the void of expectations with their own ideas about what is and is not acceptable. And I can see why this is attractive to people. Magic the Gathering is traditionally played by nerds, people who don't see their tastes reflected in mainstream culture. And a lot of the time they'll pick up this card game that looks like it has a lot of creative possibilities, only to discover that the only deck in Standard is Caw-Blade. Oh, you like this new card, Phyrexian Hydra? Yeah, Stoneforge Mystic, fetch Sword of Feast and Famine, go. Oh my god, it still feels good to say after all these years. So I can see how a format that says, hey, any way you want to play this, that's cool with us, you can make that work, could feel like a breath of fresh air. Except there's a reason other games don't work that way. Someone who wants to play Armageddon and someone who hates having their lands destroyed will categorically have a conflict with one another. When, by design, people bring their own expectations to every Commander pod, it's unavoidable. Now, you could argue that this is a bad example because it's pretty obvious that most people prefer not to play against mass land destruction, but how strict is this collective preference? What if I want to make Epicenter work, or Razia's Purification, or if I want to proliferate Myojin of Infinite Rage? Okay, we might have to cut that. I like this idea. There is no definitive answer. Even the most arcane strategy can be rendered unfun by the ethos of Rule 0. This LGS ban list and rule set used to make the rounds on the internet every so often for how ridiculous it is, but this is the format as it was intended. No Cascade, no Voltron, 170 random cards on the ban list. Who are you to say those stipulations are any less valid than no infinites, no board wipes, or no extra turns? This is Rule 0. The only limit is your ability to impose your will on other people. Any given day you go on the EDH subreddit, you will find people struggling with situations that would never arise in any other format or even any other game. These issues crop up so much that there's a social interaction post-flare. If Commander really is designed to support social games of Magic, it shouldn't need a social troubleshooting label on its main subreddit. Here's a post about a person who feels guilty for winning despite having a deck barely better than a precon. Here's one about a player at an LGS who has warped the metagame around his refusal to play against any combo, strong engines, expensive cards, proxies, generally anything he deems to be unfair, despite playing an infinite mana combo himself. And here's one about a player advocating for refusing to play against people whose playstyles you don't like after getting locked out of the game on turn 3. When the answer so often is find another group to play with, you have to wonder if maybe it's the format that's the problem. And in some cases, that isn't even possible. Here's one Twitter user who's frustrated that because he's in a rural area, he doesn't really have a choice about how the format is played. I've run into the same problem trying to play Commander on the side at the Super Smash Bros. Tournaments I travel to. Since it's not the main focus of the event, we usually end up throwing a Commander deck or two into our suitcases, and that doesn't make for balanced or fun games. And it's not really something a Rule Zero conversation can fix. And I don't think these issues are limited to just me or randos on social media. YouTube creator Salubrious Snail, whose casual credentials I don't think anyone would question, explains it perfectly in his video about CEDH.
There's not much salt at CEDH tables compared to casual. The whole idea of the format is that everything is on the table, so when somebody rushes a combo or staxes the table into oblivion, nobody gets particularly bothered about it, other than maybe about the fact they weren't able to stop it. The social aspects that make casual EDH fun to me are still present. Threat analysis, table coordination against a scary foe, trying to curry favor with a potential ally, but a lot of the more negative social aspects, the ones that come from the friction of players having different playstyles and objectives, are eliminated.
I think this post title sums it up really well. I'm tired of being responsible for other players' fun. The top commenter says, I'm in the same boat with my playgroup, I just can't seem to get it right. The Rules Committee's response to this would seem to be, you're not responsible for other players' fun, but you are responsible for helping them find the opportunity for it. Even if that were a meaningful distinction, it's wrong. That is the job of the game. And that's probably why Wizard's solution to this is the bracket system and Game Changer list. This is an implementation of additional structure, and I do think it's an admirable effort considering that Commander and its philosophy are already an entrenched system. Sheldon Menery wrote about why he resisted expanding the ban list, fearing that the format might collapse on itself the way the Prismatic format did. And while I think his fears have merit, it seems like people have embraced this additional complexity rather than backed away from it. In addition, precons being slotted for bracket 2 means, okay, they did a takesies-backsies on this, didn't they? Precons they're usually supposed to be pretty balanced with each other on power level, I think. I only ever tried the EC Tyrant of Gyrostrate one, so what the hell do I know? It's not a perfect solution. It seems pretty clear from posts like this one that 5 brackets aren't sufficient for such a broad spectrum of power levels. But more importantly, these infographics are plagued with the same vague and stilted language that we saw in the philosophy document. Using a color gradient to describe the difference between the casual and competitive mindset doesn't help explicate anything. Like, am I going to be sitting down for a game at my LGS and the players go, we're looking for a salmon game tonight, is that okay? Why is the difference from brackets 3 to 4 speed, yet there's a speed difference explicitly described between each bracket? What are literally any of these headers supposed to represent? Like, how is it possible for there to be a level above optimized? Or why does only one bracket represent upgraded? Etc., etc. As a communication tool for pregame conversations, it is nearly as confusing and contradictory as the philosophy document it's supposed to be replacing. When all the language surrounding Rule Zero and pregame conversations sounds like someone reading off of one of those I'm at my emotional capacity templates, that's going to be reflected in not only the discourse surrounding Commander, but in how people talk in and around their actual Commander games. An old snapshot of the philosophy document contained the line, players should aim to interact. If you have to give people a guidebook for interaction, it's not normal human interaction. Now, I don't really believe Commander is some kind of social hellscape, nor do I want to discourage new players from getting into it if they're considering it. I love Magic, and Commander is still Magic. I went to my LGS recently to draft for the first time in like 6 years, and was surprised to see 30 to 50 Commander players, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. But I think Commander has succeeded despite this emphasis on nebulous concepts like social play, not because of them. My overall point is this. Beyond the deluge of outside IP, the dwindling support for the tournament scene, and even the multiplayer aspect of the format, competitive players have valid reasons for disliking Commander. It's more than that it's casual. It's a format built on a contradiction, that it can encapsulate the full range of power levels and playstyles contained in Magic's 30-plus year catalog, while at the same time be balanced enough for 4 random people playing whatever they want to have a fun game. Holding it together is this Rube Goldberg machine of unwritten rules and formally enforced personal values, and I'm not interested in engaging with that. It feels like you're being told how to think rather than how to play, and I hate to say it, but I find that antisocial. Now, I said that this video wouldn't be about, as the Trinket Mage puts it, the slopification of Magic. That the philosophy with which this format developed is parallel to attempts by Hasbro to turbocharge the growth of Magic's revenue. But I lied. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So first off, Magic has always been slopified to an extent. It is the world's first trading card game, where players, often children, buy booster packs with pieces of cardboard that can be worth a wildly variable amount of money. It is a clear precursor to microtransactions and loot boxes, trends that have rightly drawn criticism from large swaths of the gaming community. And to be clear, I do believe that the vast majority of the blame for the application of these new trends to Magic lies at the feet of executives trying to wring every last drop of profit out of the franchise. But I can't help but think that just as we have apparently lost the ability to collectively determine how the game should be played, we've also lost the ability to effectively criticize how the game is created and sold. What I mean is, when we accept that the game does not have to justify itself, when it offloads the onus of creating a fair and fun environment onto the players, a logical extrapolation is that the people who make and finance the game don't have to justify themselves either. Players have long expressed frustration when the response to them disliking certain products, whether explicit or implied, is, well, this just isn't for you. But to me, that echoes the advice often given online that many Commander pods aren't for you. By the logic of Commander, Hasbro executives aren't doing anything wrong. They're just making the line go up. That's their thing. And as the Commander axiom goes, everyone should get to do their thing. And that reminds me of a much-discussed analogy involving humans and farm animals. But not the one I talked about at the beginning of the video. This is the one by George Orwell, and I want to leave you with this short passage from the very end. The source of the trouble appeared to be that Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington had each played an ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. Alright, thank you for watching. I've never made a video like this before, so please let me know what you think. All my other videos on here are about Smash 64, but I've been getting back into Magic lately, so stay tuned and maybe I'll make more of them.